to that, and also as a response to the persecutions of Catholics in England. So Elizabeth I is our queen now. She reigns for an extremely long period of time, for 45 years, from 1558 to 1603, coming to the throne after the death of her half-sister Mary Tudor. She enacted the first government-wide, state-sponsored persecution of the Catholic Church that the Western world had seen since the Roman Empire. It was the first government-sponsored active persecution of Catholics since the Roman Empire. It occurs under the reign of Elizabeth. And one of her main advisors, which helped her launch this persecution of Catholics, was a man by the name of William Cecil. And William Cecil had been Secretary of State under Edward VI, and he had Parliament declare Elizabeth queen upon the death of Mary Tudor. He then worked with Elizabeth for the next 40 years, and he primarily kept England Protestant. His efforts and his work and he established a well-known and well-organized intelligence service where he was able to spy on people in England, especially those who were Catholic, in order to ensure that England remained Protestant. And it was really he who also initiated and began and furthered the persecution of Catholics, in particular priests, in England. During this time, Elizabeth passed a law that anyone who received or assisted a Jesuit and did not turn him over to the state was to be charged with aiding and abetting rebellion. So if you knew a Jesuit, if you talked to a Jesuit, if you assisted a Jesuit and allowed him to hide in your home, or moved him from one place to another to minister to these persecuted groups of Catholics, you could be arrested, tried with treason, and executed. Another law was anyone who converted an Englishman to the Catholic faith was also guilty of treason. So if you were a Catholic and you shared your faith with another and brought them into communion with the Church in Rome, you could be arrested and executed. Now the Church responded to this Elizabethan persecution primarily through the establishment of a seminary in French Flanders. The seminary first at Douai, and then later the seminary was transferred to Reims. The seminary was financed by Pope Gregory XIII, as well as by King Philip II of Spain. And the mission of the seminary was to train priests, English priests, to know the faith, be formed well, and then sent back to England to minister to the underground church, to Catholics who were being persecuted in England. And those who went lived in extreme danger of their lives. And the men who went to the seminary knew that they were being trained almost like special operations troops to go behind enemy lines and to operate covertly, ministering to these Catholics, again, at fear of their own lives, for fear of their own lives. The first English martyr from the seminary was a man by the name of St. Cuthbert Maine, who was martyred in 1577. We also have during this time other examples of great men and holy men and women who gave their lives for the Catholic faith in England. In particular, one well-known saint is St. Edmund Campion. St. Edmund Campion arrived back in England in 1580 after studying in seminary. He wrote a defense of the faith in England that was very popular and widely read, known as Campion's Brag. He gave this great defense of the Catholic Church, trying to bring England or Englishmen back to the faith. He was betrayed, found out that he was operating as a priest, betrayed, captured by the Elizabethan authorities, and then tortured. He was racked horribly and also had his fingernails ripped off during his time in prison. He was tried with the trumped-up charges with the attempted murder of Queen Elizabeth I, and actually the jury during his trial was bribed to ensure his conviction. He was such a holy man and a well-known man because of this letter, this defense of the faith he had written, his brag, that the Elizabethan authorities wanted to ensure that he would be convicted, so they did so by bribing the jury. At his conviction, he made this great statement of faith. He said, "In condemning us, you condemn all your own ancestors, all the ancient priests, bishops, and kings, all that was once the glory of England, the island of saints, and the most devoted child of the see of Peter. For what we have taught, however, you may qualify it with the odious name of treason that they did not uniformly teach, to be condemned with these old lights, not of England only, but of the world, by their degenerate descendants, is both gladness and glory to us." So he reminds the jury and Elizabethan authorities that by condemning him, you are condemning yourselves. You're condemning all of your ancestors who were firm and faithful believers in the Catholic faith and supporters of the Pope in Rome. So he was convicted. He was then executed by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. Another martyr during this period of time was a holy woman by the name of St. Margaret Clitheroe. Margaret Clitheroe was a young mother of 30 years old. She was a very joy-filled woman. Her husband was a Protestant, but she converted to the Catholic faith, and she hid priests in her home so that they could minister to Catholics throughout England. And remember, we said that this, under Elizabeth's rule, if you aided a priest, if you hid a priest in your house, even associated with a priest, you could be charged with aiding and abetting rebellion. So she was found out, she was captured, brought before the court. She refused to plead when she was brought before court because she refused to even recognize the legitimacy of these laws against Catholics in England. Ultimately, she was convicted and then executed in a most horrible way by being pressed to death. And what they did was they laid her on the ground, they put a board on top of her, and they put rocks and weights, slowly adding rocks and weights on the board until she was ultimately crushed and pressed to death. Her sons, she had 2 sons, they became priests, and she had a daughter who then became a nun as well. So a family greatly devoted to the Catholic faith, to the example of their mother, who had given her own life for the church. Now in 1571, Pope Paul III responds to the persecution of Catholics in England by excommunicating Elizabeth for heresy. Now this was understandable theologically and perhaps necessary, and what he tried, but politically ended up being a very bad decision in England. Because remember, as I've said in our last session, how the English loved the faith, the people loved the faith and were loyal to the faith, but they also were very much loyal to their queen, very much loyal to their monarch. And so this excommunication by Paul III was used by William Cecil and others as a way of propaganda to tell the English people that, see, look, here we have another foreign prince, another foreign head of government, the Pope, trying to tell us how we should live our lives in England, telling us how our government should be structured, attacking our beloved Queen. So this was really ultimately a very difficult decision for the English to accept, and it caused this ability for Cecil and others, Elizabethan authorities, to use it as propaganda. It really kind of ensured this, and then also the gunpowder plot in the 17th century, a few years after this event, really ensured that England would continue along the path of Protestantism, because what ended up happening is that Catholicism was associated with being anti-English. If you were Catholic, you were also you were not a patriot. You did not love your country. And these 2 events, this excommunication in England as well as the gunpowder plot in the 17th century, where Catholics were accused of trying to blow up Parliament, then led to this establishment in the minds of the English people that if you were Catholic, you were against your country. And that is pervasive. It was pervasive throughout English society and English culture for the next several hundred centuries, or for the next several centuries. It really caused the main problem for the restoral of the faith, or any attempt to restore the faith in England. Elizabeth ultimately dies in 1603. She's succeeded by James I, who was the son of Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots. James I is well known for a few things. One, it was under his reign where the King James Bible was first brought into being. The whole translation of the scriptures into English in that particular format. Also, he also passed a series of anti-Catholic laws where he barred Catholics from the professions of medicine and law, and also stipulated that Catholics could not carry weapons. So we see this whole persecution of Catholics under Elizabeth continuing under her successor, James I. So this is what happens to the church in England. Now what happens elsewhere? What's going on the continent during this period of time? If you look in your workbook, we have a map that shows the effect of the Protestant Revolution for the rest of Europe. It shows which countries remained loyal to the church and which countries then left the church and embraced Protestant ideals. The century between 1550 and 1650 on the continent was one of a series of conflicts and religious wars. In France in particular, during this time, we have a very weak monarchy. Henry II was killed in a jousting tournament. His wife was Catherine de' Medici. She was very unpopular in France because she was Italian. And the sons that she had with Henry II were very unhealthy in mind and body. And so from 1562 to 1598, during this 60-year period of time, or so, this 30-year period of time, there were a series of religious wars throughout France. And very nasty wars. We even have an account of one Protestant leader who would go around France whenever he found a priest, would execute the priest, cut the priest's ears off, and then he built a necklace of these priests' ears and would wear them around when he marched into battle. Very nasty, nasty war in France during this period of time. Ultimately, this conflict, this religious conflict in France, comes to an end with the arrival of Henry IV. Henry IV was Henry of Bourbon, who was a Protestant, but ultimately he converts to the Catholic faith. He besieged Paris for 6 months in 1590. It was a huge siege, a lot of starvation. People died, 13,000 people died of starvation in the month of July alone in the city of Paris. Philip II, the King of Spain, sent an army to help relieve the siege of the city of Paris against this Henry IV, the Protestant leader in France at the time. So Henry negotiates an end to the religious wars. He knew he couldn't defeat the great Spanish army, so he negotiates an end to the war, and how he does that is by accepting Catholicism and being converted, coming into the church. And he said, famously, it's attributed to him that he said the reason why he converted was because Paris is worth a mass. So Paris is worth a mass. So Henry decided to come into the church. He eventually passes what's known as the Edict of Nantes in 1598, which gives Protestants a certain level of autonomy within France and brings about a relative peace in the country. In Germany, the birthplace of the Protestant Revolution with Martin Luther, we have a series of wars here in the middle of the 16th century between Charles V and the Protestant princes. Charles ultimately wins a big victory in 1547 at the Battle of Mulberg, and after this victory, where he thinks he has finally defeated Protestantism in Germany, he repeats the famous line of Julius Caesar, but he changes it a bit. He says after this battle, he says, "I came, I saw, God conquered." Instead of "I came, I saw, I conquered," "I came, I saw, God conquered." And so he's hoping that there's peace in Germany. Ultimately, there's a very unsteady peace that occurs in Germany as a result of these religious wars. And that's brought about through the religious peace of Augsburg in 1555. And what this religious peace of Augsburg maintains is that Lutheran states would be recognized with equal sovereignty of Catholic states. And how you would determine the religion of a particular region in Germany was based upon the religion adopted by the secular prince of that region. In Latin, this phrase came to be known as cuius regio, eius religio, meaning his region, his religion. So if you were living in a region and your prince was a Catholic, then everyone in that region, everyone in that princedom, everyone in that realm had to be Catholic. If you lived with a Lutheran prince or a Lutheran duke, then you had to be Lutheran. So we can see, it really didn't create any kind of lasting peace. So it didn't provide for your opportunity or your ability to choose your faith. Rather, your faith was forced upon you. So if you had been Catholic, but your prince converts to Lutheranism, then you had to also follow your prince. This ultimately leads later in the 17th century to a very nasty war in Germany known as the 30 Years' War, because it reigned for 30 years, from 1618 to 1648. Now, the struggle in Germany, unfortunately, it was maintained during this 30-year war primarily through the influence of one man in France. Unfortunately, that man was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, Cardinal Richelieu. France, during this period of time, is more concerned with consolidating, Richelieu in particular, is more concerned with consolidating the absolute power of the monarch in France. And he embarks on a foreign policy that is centered on that one tenet. So he would enter into treaties with Protestant groups, or would help and provide aid to Protestants, especially in Germany, in order to help uplift France and make France a powerful nation. So he's fighting really against the Holy Roman Emperor. And one of the main power players against France in this time is the Holy Roman Empire, who is Catholic. So if you're trying to create France and make France to be in a great power, then you have to do whatever you can in foreign policy to limit the effectiveness of the Holy Roman Empire. And so you do that by fostering Protestants and aiding Protestants in their war against Catholics in Germany. And this is what Cardinal Richelieu did. Ultimately, though, what he does is he has Gustav Adolf, who's King of Sweden, come into Germany and fight against the Catholics there. And ultimately, he begins to win a series of battles and wars. And so the Catholics are losing in the 30-Year War. Eventually, though, there's kind of a stalemate that comes into play in Germany, and a peace is brought about through the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And what the Treaty of Westphalia does is it permanently divides Germany into Protestant regions and Catholic regions. Predominantly the Protestants will occupy the northern part of Germany, and Catholics predominantly the southern part of Germany. So this really, as we see, we begin to see through Cardinal Richelieu and his whole example, a real difficult time for the church in the 17th century. The church is no longer able to really control or move secular rulers or even princes of the church, cardinals, to adopt Catholic policy in terms of foreign policy and their relations with other nations. Nation states are now no longer concerned with what the Pope thinks or with the United Christendom, rather they're concerned about their own ideas, their own power, their own position in the world. And so this causes a great problem for the church, and we'll see this manifest itself even further in our next time period of revolutions and modernism, where we have European nations move away from the faith, and these revolutions come up that will attack the church and even remove the church from European society. So now come back to our story, though, of Reformation. How does the church authentically reform herself? This is our time period of Catholic Reformation, and we mentioned at the beginning of this session that the church reforms herself primarily through the Council of Trent, through the establishment of the Society of Jesus, and also through the bringing of, by the Holy Spirit, of holy men and women, of these saints who come into the history of the church, the story of our church, to help reform her from within. So the Council of Trent is called by Pope Paul III. It meets from 1545 to 1563. Now that seems like a very long period of time. It is, 18 some odd years. But it doesn't mean that the council actually met continuously for 18 years. There were different sessions of the council that met only for brief periods of time, but it took 18 years for all of these sessions to be completed because of different political reasons, which we'll discuss when we get into each of these sessions. Now, why was Trent chosen as the site for this council? Well, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had been calling for a council, an ecumenical council, to convene, to meet, to address the Protestant problem for years. But it had taken a long time for the church to actually respond to this. So Paul III finally responds to it, and he agrees with Charles V's idea that the council meet in the imperial city of Trent, which is in northern Italy. It was a geographically well-suited city. It was close to Germany and also to Rome. It was almost halfway, so it's easy for people to travel back and forth. It was a small city of about 10,000 people, but it was a good place, a good central location, really, to meet. Interestingly enough, Protestants were actually invited to come and participate, or at least be a part of the proceedings of the council. They refused to come. And this is one of the reasons why Trent was chosen, was again because it was on the main road from Germany to Italy, so it was hope. The hope was that people, the Protestants from Germany, would come to the council. One of the council fathers actually wrote, "We have chosen this city at the entrance to Germany, on the very threshold, so to speak, of their house, in order to remove all suspicion from their minds. We have refused to be guarded by troops. We have issued letters of safe conduct, which they themselves have framed. We have waited long for them. We have begged and implored them to come and gain knowledge from the light of truth." So the church was very open and desirous of Protestants to come and to be a part of the Council of Trent in order that they could hear the teachings of the church and perhaps even be brought back into communion with the church. Now, the Council of Trent was called for two main purposes. The first was to define authentic doctrine in response to the teachings of the Protestants. There had not been any major theological statement from Rome on the Protestant revolt since 1520, when Leo X issued his bull, Exsurge Domini, against Martin Luther. So it had been several years, almost a generation really, since Rome had even given any kind of theological statement or teaching on what was going on in Germany and elsewhere. So that was the first purpose, was to define authentic Catholic doctrine. The second purpose was to reform the life of the church. Now this council, the Council of Trent, was a very active and very prodigious council. It produced more decrees and more canons, more documents by volume than the whole of the legislation of the previous 18 ecumenical councils. So it really was a very, very involved, complex, and very well organized council that looked at the entire life of the church and every teaching of the church in order to respond to this Protestant revolution. It ultimately issued forth produced 16 dogmatic decrees, 16 total dogmatic decrees, so a wealth of knowledge and of teaching from this council. Now, unfortunately, political trouble in Western Europe continued to plague the